Have you ever noticed patterns in your relationships that you don't fully understand, even when you wish you did? Maybe reactions you wish you didn't have, or fears that seem bigger than the situation in front of you? Sometimes those patterns are formed much earlier than we realize. Long before psychology existed, scripture was already talking about things like the heart, the mind, the soul, our struggles, and healing. It speaks honestly about human brokenness and restoration. And one of the things you see throughout the Bible is that healing can happen in different ways. Sometimes it's a process, and sometimes it's miraculous. And that's where I think it becomes really interesting to explore the places where biblical wisdom and psychological understanding intersect. Because when you really start looking at scripture, you realize the Bible speaks very deeply about the human experience. Our wounds, our struggles, the way we think, the way we relate to each other, and the way transformation happens in our lives. So, today, I just want to talk a little bit about that intersection between faith and psychology and some of the things I've learned along the way. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever reacted strongly to something in a relationship and later wondered, why did that affect me so deeply? Questions like that are actually what first made me start digging into this topic. And something people may not know about me is that a couple of years ago, I was in a doctoral program for clinical psychology. I wasn't in the program for very long, but the subject itself has always fascinated me. Understanding why people think the way they do, why certain patterns show up in relationships, and how emotional wounds form, and how people heal. These are things I've spent years reading and learning about on my own. And honestly, I think I probably always will. Because my faith has always been central to my life, I've never been interested in studying psychology in isolation from faith. I've always been curious about what happens when you look at the human mind and emotional healing through the lens of scripture. At one point, when I was in that program, I wanted to write some papers on exploring psychology from a Christian framework, looking at emotional healing and human development in light of biblical truth. But it became pretty clear that that perspective wasn't really welcomed in that academic environment anyway, at least not to the capacity I wanted. And that created a tension for me because for me, faith isn't separate from understanding people, it's foundational in how I understand the human heart. So eventually, I realized the direction I felt called toward, integrating faith and healing and helping people, probably wasn't going to fit well within that path. So I stepped away. And then since then, I've been pursuing more Christ centered work, finding my way around healing and ministry. But my curiosity about psychology and the human mind never went away. And one of the areas that has really fascinated me is something called attachment theory. You may have heard people talking about it recently because it's become a pretty popular topic today. But in case you've never heard of it, attachment theory is basically the idea that our earliest relationships, especially the people who raised us, like parents, grandparents, or others who cared for us, but those can shape the way we experience our relationships later in life. Over time, researchers began noticing patterns in the way people relate to one another. From that research came what we now call attachment styles: secure attachment, anxious attachment, dismissive avoidant attachment, and fearful avoidant attachment. These aren't meant to keep people in boxes. They're simply patterns researchers noticed in the way people tend to experience human connection. And sometimes when people hear these patterns described, it can be eye opening because they suddenly recognize parts of their own story in them. For example, Someone with anxious attachment might send a message to someone they care about and not get a reply right away. And suddenly their mind starts racing. They think, did I say something wrong? Did I upset them? Are they pulling away? That reaction is rarely about that one moment. Often it's connected to earlier experiences when love felt uncertain. On the other side, someone with a more dismissive attachment, like the dismissive avoidant, might be triggered when relationships start getting emotionally close. Something inside them pulls back, not because they don't care, but because closeness once felt uncomfortable or unsafe. And sometimes simply understanding that can be the beginning of healing. But the Bible actually speaks about emotional wounds very directly. In Psalms 147:3, it says, He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. And then I have the Amplified version here, which goes on and says, curing their pains and their sorrows. So that reminds us that God acknowledges that wounds exist, and healing is part of his heart for us. And while we're talking about the mind and how patterns can form over time, listen to what scripture also says in Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed with the renewal of your mind, so that you may prove what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So this scripture shows us that transformation is possible. Real transformation is possible. And what's fascinating is the idea that we just read about in scripture, the renewal of the mind, is something scientists studying the brain have been discovering as well. Today, researchers talk about how our brains form patterns in circuits based on our experiences. In other words, the brain learns pathways over time. And the encouraging part is that those pathways can actually change, which means the patterns that formed earlier in life don't necessarily have to define the rest of our story. Healing is not just about changing behavior, it's about restoring identity. Because the way we see ourselves often shapes the way we experience relationships. And one of the things attachment theory shows us is that the patterns we learn in our earliest relationships can follow us into adulthood. They can influence how we connect with friends, how we experience our romantic relationships, and sometimes even how we experience our relationship with God. Because if love felt uncertain growing up, sometimes it can be hard to fully trust love later, even God's love. Not because God isn't trustworthy, but because our hearts learned certain patterns very early, which is one of the reasons healing matters so much. And in many ways, that's actually part of what this whole channel is about. Learning to live from the place of being loved by God. What I sometimes think of as the beloved life. Because while we're understanding our patterns, and that can help us recognize our old wounds, it doesn't ultimately heal them. And that's where Jesus comes in. When you look at the life of Jesus, one of the things that stands out is how often he embraced wounded people, the rejected, the overlooked, the people who felt unseen. Jesus didn't just avoid brokenness, he moved toward it. He healed the sick, he restored the rejected, he welcomed the outcast. Psychology can sometimes help us recognize the pattern, but Jesus heals the wound. If you've struggled with patterns in relationships or wounds from earlier in life, there is real hope for healing, because the God who created the human heart also knows how to restore it. If you've never placed your trust in Jesus, his invitation is open to you. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And healing begins with simply turning toward him. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had a moment where you realized something from childhood was affecting your relationships today? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for being here. I truly hope something in this conversation helped someone today. And welcome to the beloved life.